Hi everyone, I'm Tanya Carpenter. I'm course leader for the MSc in Counselling, and I'm here today to help you think about how you can be more critical in all of the assignments that you're given on this Masters and how you can gain marks by doing so. So we're going to be looking at a number of different areas of this topic about being critical. To start with, we're going to be thinking about what it actually means to be critical. And this is a really important topic because it's something which you really want to make personal to yourself. So one other area we're going to be looking at is what stops you from being critical. And that's an area where I'd really like you to do a bit of that reflexive stuff and think about what holds you back from being critical. Because once you know what might be holding you back from being more critical, then we can have an opportunity to see in which areas you want to focus your development on. So we're going to be thinking first about what it means to be critical. We're also then going to be looking at why you need to be critical, and you absolutely do at master's level. And we're going to be thinking about really what that's about. And hopefully once we've gotten over those first two ideas, we'll then be thinking more practically about how do I actually do it? And we're going to be splitting that into how to critique literature and how to critique research, because they're the same and also different. And then finally, we're going to be talking about what gains marks at MSc level. So what are your markers looking for when they mark any piece of your work? And hopefully that will help you start to develop some ideas. So what does it mean being critical? Well, of course, any academic piece, including this very PowerPoint, should probably look immediately to the literature. These are the kinds of skills which we want you guys to be thinking about. Of course, you're going to be thinking to yourself about what it means to be critical. So that's a question I'd like to ask you. What do you think it means to be critical in academia? But what I'd also like you to do immediately when you come up with a concept, or immediately when you're asked about a concept, is go straight to the literature. And that's what I did when I was thinking about this question. And here's what the literature tells me. It says that critical thinking is the process of uncovering the authenticity, accuracy, and worthiness of information or knowledge claims. What do you think about that statement? What are your own thoughts about that statement? That is part of being critical. Let's move on to the next one. This is a direct quote. Critical thinking is reasonable, reflective thinking that is focused on deciding what to believe or do. And another direct quote, critical thinking is that mode of thinking about any subject, content, or problem in which the thinker improves the quality of his or her thinking by skillfully taking charge of the structures inherent in thinking and imposing intellectual standards upon them. So in a way, that's what we've just done just now. We've thought to ourselves about what critical thinking or critical analysis might mean. We've gone to the literature and checked what the literature says about what critical analysis and critical thinking means. And by doing so, we've imposed intellectual standards upon our own thinking. And in a way, that's what we're trying to do in psychology. Remember that psychology, which is the discipline that this master's sits in, that your master's sits in, is very much established itself over the years, or tried to establish itself over the years, as a science. And in science, things have to be testable in some way, or we have to evaluate them, and we have to be rigorous in all of our methods and in all of our analysis and in all of our critique. And I think this skill is really at the core of all of that. That said, when we come on to critical thinking, we would also go a bit further. Here are 3 different ways of conceptualizing critical thinking. We could now go beyond those by evaluating those claims in and of themselves. So that's just our first step into critical analysis. We're there already, we're doing it just in this one slide. Can you see that? Take a moment to have a look at that and replay this audio if you need to. The process that we've just done is already about being critical and already about going to the literature to ratify or to impose these intellectual standards on ideas that we might already come up with. So then the next question, why do I need to be critical? Well, I think in my experience, what I've noticed is that what holds some people back from being critical is somehow perhaps feeling like a fraud, feeling like you're not allowed to be critical. And I think it's really important at master's level in particular that you accept that by choosing this master's, you are now in the academic community and there are responsibilities on you to be critical. Because what's really important about critical analysis is it actually isn't designed to just be picking all the flaws out in what you read and in literature. It isn't designed to be criticism. Critical analysis is slightly different. It's about coming up with new ideas by looking at where the gaps might have been in various bits of literature. So really important that you start to see within yourself, you've gotten onto your masters. So whoever accepted you onto your masters thinks that you've got the potential. And it's really important now that you see that by being in this academic community, you have a responsibility to be critical about the literature you read. It in itself aids the academic process because when you're critical about literature, you offer new perspectives, you offer new ideas. And I think that's really important for you to take on as a responsibility as a master's student. I think it's also worth knowing that being critical and being a master's level 7 student is a lifelong transferable skill. I wonder if you can just do a quick little reflexive thought right now. If you stop the audio after this, can you think of examples of when it might be useful to be critical? Now, I could tell you as a counselling psychologist that this skill is incredibly important to me because if I work with a client who tells me their perspective, of course that's incredibly important, but I'm also going to be thinking about what other people might be experiencing of this client, the context that this client might be in, and that's not about undermining what this client is saying to me. It's about being critical in evaluating all the data that I see around me when I meet with a client. So that's just my experience as a counselling psychologist, but I wonder if you can think about where you think critical thinking might be useful. Take a moment to think about it. I really hope that was helpful, and I really hope that I'm beginning to sell you on the idea of being critical, not least because it's absolutely imperative at your masters, but because I really want you to buy into the idea that it's important, because I think that will really help you when you come to writing. But I could go back to the literature again and have a look at what's in it for you. Why is it important for you to be critical in your thinking? And here's some research that I found. So the first piece of research noted that critical thinking was actually a better predictor of making successful life decisions than pure intelligence itself. Can you think about why that might be? Take a moment. Why might critical thinking be a better predictor of making successful life decisions than just being really, really intelligent? And this other earlier piece where participants were given some critical thinking training, perhaps a little bit like what we're doing now. And funnily enough, they also performed better in decision making and in understanding concepts. Can you think about why that might be? Take a moment to think about these two different papers, and the references are in the reference section. Think about why these researchers might have found what they found. Do you feel like you're beginning to see why being critical is such an important skill in academic writing and in academic reading and in academic research? I really hope so. The other thing that I wanted to point out then is about what might stop you from being critical. And these are things, again, I really want you to consider. Something that might stop you is thinking about word count. I don't have enough word count to be critical because I've got to get these research papers analysed in some way, or I've got to compare and contrast that research paper, or I've got to try and express an idea. And I think that that's an important idea, and hopefully we can come on to that when we come to think about how you actually write critically. But certainly I would look at that as a motivator that can sometimes stop critical analysis from happening. I've already mentioned this idea about feeling inferior. You may feel that uh, somebody that publishes a piece of research must clearly be much more intellectually capable or have a better reputation, or somehow that you're not allowed to critique papers. And I can see that perspective, but I also think that actually you could bring something really new to the table that might not have been considered before. And I don't think it's helpful to discount yourself for lack of experience or age or any of the other things that you may discount yourself for. If you're using other research and a good argument backed up with literature and research to critique a paper, then I think you're well within your rights to do so. You may also feel that you don't have the vocabulary to know how to critique literature. That's also something which you can look at yourself. Obviously, that's something which you can try to develop yourself, but we'll also try and see what we can do in terms of the support that you'll get on your masters. And finally, you may not know what to look for. How do you know what to critique? Again, that's something that we are going to cover in the lecture today. Take a moment to think about what stops you from being critical when you do your writing. Here's a little video which I found really useful when I read it, when I watched it. It is a video which doesn't say who it's aimed at, but I don't see why it couldn't be universal. I think it's sort of a beginner's guide to analysing academic literature and to making academic arguments. Have a look at it, see how you feel about it. Any feedback would be great. Be really pleased to know how you think about it. Some of you may have seen it before, but have a watch. How did you find that video? Hopefully it's been informative and helpful. And now let's move on to all the different ways that we're going to think about critiquing. So we're going to start off with how to critique research. Oh, let me count the ways. If you are on an MSc in counselling, it's very worthwhile knowing that generally speaking, the general consensus is that all psychotherapy research is flawed. It's massively flawed, and it's an argument which I would like to see from counselling students emerging in debates and emerging in assignments, because it is so well recognised that there are so many ways that psychotherapy research is flawed that we really do have to attend to them. For those of you who aren't on an MSc counselling, I'm sure that within your own discipline you'll also find that all research has flaws, because it is completely impossible to create the perfect piece of research. So let's think about all the ways that we can critique research. Now, this isn't comment papers or opinion pieces or theory. This is purely about research. So the first thing to think about are who were the participants in this study. Now, some of you may know that in psychology research and psychotherapy research, often one of the main issues is that most participants in many psychology studies are female psychology students. What might be the problem with that? I'm sure I don't need to tell you. The other thing to consider are whether there were sufficient numbers within the participants, and was there diversity amongst the students. Now, of course, if you have female psychology students in somewhere like the UK or the US, then you might be thinking about whether there was sufficient diversity within those female psychology students. And that is something that you can absolutely use to critique a piece of research. Because what does that then mean about how applicable that piece is to any other body of communities? So the next thing we can critique are the methods themselves, so the methods that were used in the research. You want to be thinking about the disadvantages of quantitative research. Questionnaires, for instance, do they do what they need to do? Do they really capture human experience? Or are they rather limited as to what aspects of human experiences they can capture? Are they culturally compatible? If you are looking at a questionnaire that was done in another country, is that compatible with the culture that you are trying to write in? But it's also worthwhile thinking about the disadvantages of qualitative research. In qualitative research, we may only be interviewing 5 to 8 or 10 people. Is that really enough to really capture a general consensus about a particular phenomena? These are all things which you can talk about, and you can always find literature to support both of those arguments. Out of interest, I just wanted to talk about some other effects that we might find in terms of the methods in research. So imagine if you are taking part in a piece of research yourself, the Hawthorne effect. Notice that participants will seem to modify their behaviour in response to being observed. Now, for those of you doing MSc counselling, and I may make a few references to that, it's worthwhile noting that, for instance, if somebody is being observed as part of a therapeutic intervention, how will they change their behaviour if they know that the intervention itself is being tested? But of course, we could adapt that to any psychology research, I'm sure. It's interesting to note about the John Henry effect, the behaviour of the control group, that actually the John Henry effect suggests that when the control group know that they are the control group, they also change their behaviour, and their behaviour is also different. The novelty effect, which some of you might find in newer pieces of research. When participants are given a new piece of technology, they actually seem to perform better initially because of the novelty of being given a new piece of technology. So imagine if somebody is given, let's say, a heart rate monitor and told to do more exercise. Might the novelty effect apply there? So you can already see in the methods that researchers choose that they must themselves, of course, know that there are flaws with them, and noting those flaws can often be very, very useful to understanding that that piece of research is not perfect. It's worthwhile bearing in mind at this point that this is by no means an exhaustive list of how to critique research. These are just a few pointers to get you started. But let's carry on. Let's now think about how you can critique the result of a piece of research. So, obviously the main thing you're going to be wanting to know is, was it significant? Were the results significant? Did items have to get removed from questionnaires in order to make them more valid or reliable? And what might that mean about the research in terms of the participants that took part in that research, or the culture in which that research happened? Really importantly for psychotherapy research are dropout rates. Now, I do want to see people talking about dropout rates when it comes to psychotherapy research, because it's really endemic in psychotherapy research that participants drop out. And then that means, how powerful is that piece of research, and what might have been the motivations to drop out? The other thing to notice is whether researchers have paid due diligence to these results in their own discussion section. Because if you have researchers that aren't really getting to the limitations and the flaws in their studies, then I think that's worthy of critiquing. So then let's think about the discussion sections. Do the researchers talk about the implications for particular groups of people, ages, cultures, social circumstances? How have the results, or how might the results be implicated for different groups of people? The discussion section should talk about the limitations of the study design. The discussion section should talk about a number of aspects of implications for other groups and implications for other research. And these are all ideas which you should be gathering to create your argument about that piece of research. The other thing that you can talk about is whether the idea was novel. Sometimes results are not significant, or have very high dropout rates, or have very low participants, but actually the idea was very novel, and it might have been the first of its kind, and that's something that you can also mention. So as well as critiquing in terms of pulling it down, which are some of the things we're also doing, you might also think about how to mitigate or balance out some of that critique as well. Again, another thing to notice, what I'm suggesting here are ways that we can critique research and literature, but what you might also find is actually to the contrary. So you may be noting that there was a large participant number, or that there weren't just female psychology students, or that the researchers gave really due diligence to implications, further research, limitations. So what I'm suggesting are the sort of the negative aspects potentially of a piece of research, but you might also find the positive aspects of those very same themes in any kind of paper that you read. So that's just something I wanted to note at this stage. So now let's move on to how to critique literature in general. So any piece of literature, this could be a textbook, a chapter, a piece of research, an opinion piece, a case study. Let's think in general about how to critique literature. The first thing we're going to want to think about is the age of the paper. Now, this is quite important because there are going to be some papers that you might be using from the 1930s to the 1950s, which are still as relevant today. So, for instance, if you were going to be quoting Freud, if it was appropriate to do so, you are going to be using older papers potentially, and you might try and use some newer ones to sort of enhance that argument. But if you're going to be talking about, for instance, internet-based therapies or much newer ideas, you're probably going to need to have papers that were written within at least sort of the last 5 to 7 years. I mean, that's sort of just a sort of guesstimation. But think about the age of the paper as appropriate to the thing that you're talking about. So, for instance, if you want to be talking about various political context, you're going to be wanting to think about how the political landscape has changed a lot in the UK, for instance. For those of you who are going to be talking about healthcare settings or the NHS, you're going to be wanting to think about how the NHS has changed quite a lot. It's worthwhile noting for counselling students that IAPT first started in 2008. So if you're getting papers about the NHS pre-2008, you're going to be wanting to note that that's way before IAPT started. So think about the age of the paper, not in a way to say I can only read or cite papers from the last 5 years, but to be thinking about what it is you're actually writing about. And of course, that then gives you some critique to go on, because you can be saying, this is a really interesting and novel idea, but it's a very old paper. Or this is a very interesting and novel idea, and it's a really new paper. The other thing you want to be thinking about is who might have funded the paper. Now, this can really gain marks actually if you're clever about it and you can see where motivations might have come from. Because, of course, when you think about who funds papers, you might be thinking about what sort of outcomes those funders might be looking for. So those are a few things to get you started on that. Let's delve a little bit deeper. It's very unlikely that you're going to be looking at journals which are not peer-reviewed, because it's quite hard to find them actually. I struggled to find some. But what you want to be looking at are the journals that research papers or papers that you're looking at were published in. You want to make sure that they are published by a reputable publisher, and there's a list of them along the side here. You obviously want to be making sure that any piece of literature that you use is peer-reviewed. And if you want to know more about peer review, it might be worth just doing a quick search on it and why peer review is so important. I mean, in many ways, what we are doing is not dissimilar to peer review. We are really analysing and critiquing a paper to make sure that it's academically stringent enough to be accepted by the academic community. You want to be thinking about the journal that something was published in, because you might want to be thinking about things like cultural relevance, age, and other aspects of a journal's context. Please, if possible, try not to use layman websites. It probably will get picked up by a marker and it's just not worth it. If at all possible, please try not to use things like the Mind website unless you literally can't find it anywhere else. Please don't use WebMD. Never use Wikipedia. And there are a number of other websites which we've seen students use over the years, which are intended for lay people and which are not really appropriate at academic level. Remember, this is master's level. Remember what I said before about you being a member of the academic community now. You should be going beyond layman websites, please. Right, so here we are at the big crossroads. How do I actually write this stuff? Well, I sense within myself that many of you might be looking for a silver bullet, the perfect recipe to writing the perfect assignment. And I wish I could give that to you, I really do, but I can't. And one of the reasons I can't is because you will all write so differently. And of course, part of the challenge of being an academic is about learning how to write yourself and to develop your own voice. But what I will do my best to do is give you some pointers and show you something of the formulas that we might use. And you're always welcome to seek support where you can from tutors and from librarians and from the academic writers in residence, who are a fantastic resource. So let's see where we get up to. Some of you may have seen this before. If you were writing an essay, or if you were writing a reflective piece, or if you were writing most academic pieces actually, your academic piece should probably look a little bit like this, maybe. If you were writing an essay, if it were about a 3,000 word essay, we would normally say to focus on 2 or 3 main themes, and those are those little funnels that you can see here. And then within those 2 or 3 main themes, you should be thinking about a couple of themes per theme. Now, this is where things get tricky because it will very much depend on your word count, and it's really important to recognise that markers will be looking for breadth, which shows that you've read extensively around the subject and can talk about a theme from a number of different perspectives, but you can also go into depth, which means that you're not afraid to really grapple with one theme within a theme in particular. So what I've done here is I've put 3 main themes, but you could have 2. And I've also put some main themes with only 2 sub-themes sometimes, and sometimes 3. So 2 sub-themes might be, let's talk about the therapeutic relationship. And in theme 1, we're going to talk about the importance of the therapeutic relationship, and we're going to break that down into the client's perception and the therapist's perception, and that's all we're going to do in that one theme. But we're really going to try and grapple with that theme in depth and some breadth. So that's why it's so tricky for me to give you that silver bullet, because that's where you make editorial decisions. But it is important to note that breadth and depth are equally important, and if you can get the balance right, you're on a good footing. The next thing you're going to want to do after doing these individual little sub-themes as well as the 2 or 3 main themes is synthesizing as you go along. So throughout each little theme, throughout each main theme, at the end, synthesis is really going to help to pull your argument together. I just want to draw your attention to the kinds of things we mean by synthesis. Your synthesis is your big or little therefore. And you can use the word therefore if it's helpful. But what we want you to be thinking about is, what does this little theme mean about the question as a whole? What does this main theme mean about the question as a whole? What does it mean about the discipline? What does this little theme mean about the discipline as a whole? Or what does this main theme mean about the discipline? What does it mean about out there? So that's your theory to practice links. What does it mean about what research should be doing and where it should be going and what it should be focusing on? What does it mean about the government, the NHS, policymakers? What should schools be considering? What should internet providers be considering? What should therapists be considering? Your synthesis is where you really get some context going, and we'll think about this a little bit later as well. So think as you go along, not just about evaluating and critiquing the papers, but what that is all in the endeavour of. It's all in the endeavour of answering the question that you've been set, and your synthesis is what allows you to draw all the way back to that throughout your piece. Have a look at this taxonomy here. Have a good old read of it. What do you think about it? It's actually a taxonomy which we use when we're thinking about how to design learning materials. And it's very widely used in education, but I think it's important to share it with you here because it talks about the different levels of conceptualizing and different levels of understanding and analysing and creating. And really at master's level, we want you to be hitting a range of them, but we definitely want you to be hitting the ones at the top. So the purple, the blue and the green. We definitely want to see some of those in your assignments. Have a think about how you might do that. What kinds of vocabulary might you need? What kinds of skill might you need to really hit some of those ones at the top there? Here it is again, expressed in a different way. When you look at some of the words here and notice some of the skills as expressed in vocabulary that this uses. Now, this might be something that helps direct you towards the kind of vocabulary that you might be looking for when you're trying to hit some of those top ones in evaluation and synthesis. So we're looking at words like comparing and assessing and judging and critiquing. These are all skills which we would want to see you doing at level 7. Here in the next few slides, I'm going to be sharing with you some of the things which, as a marker and as someone who's marked across a number of levels and as somebody who's been part of a moderation team, these are things that we've looked for as markers and will continue to look for in your work this year. So here's a few pointers about what could gain marks at MSc level. The things in red italics will refer to the ideas of synthesis, which we're going to come on to. So what gains marks at MSc level? What markers like to see is not just critiquing literature by using some of the skills that we talked about before, but actually using other literature to critique literature. So you might say, for instance, according to Kahn, this particular theory is this, this and this, but according to Cohen, actually they reported it was this, this and this. In terms of pieces of research, you might, for instance, say that this piece of research utilised 75 female psychology students, which according to so-and-so is very common in psychology research and undermines the discipline as a whole. So using other literature to critique the literature is something that can really demonstrate that you've really read around a particular argument. When we move on from that, we're then going to want to ask questions like, does this mean there isn't consensus about the issue? And that's something which you can absolutely say as part of your argument. If so-and-so says this and so-and-so says this, then what it suggests is that about this particular phenomena, there is no consensus. If there is no consensus, what should we do about that? That can form part of your argument. It might be that more research is needed. What type of research is needed? It might be that research is needed in particular countries, funded by somebody else, funded in a different part of the country. There are all sorts of possibilities and potentials. But what I can say is that when you use literature against other literature, you're really demonstrating the skill of understanding the complexity of the issues at hand. Here's a free piece of advice. Always look at the discussion section of a paper. Now, discussion sections are going to be at the end of research papers. They're going to be quite lengthy at times, but they're also going to be at the ends of case studies. They're going to be at the ends of any kind of piece of literature. They'll be at the ends of chapters in textbooks, and they're something that you really want to be utilising. They'll give you some real nuggets to use. And here are some of the questions that you can be asking. So what do the authors or researchers think the issue with the piece were? So it might be that someone is noting in a non-research piece that there's this particular issue with this particular theory in this particular context. Where do they think it's going? What's the problem with it? What do they say? What do the authors or researchers needs to be done next? That will be often something that's talked about in a discussion section. And you also want to be looking at how the authors or researchers use things like contextualization and issues around diversity. So what that will often do is confirm to you perhaps some of your own critique that you were noticing about the paper, and you can then use things, sentences like, Indeed, the authors themselves also noted that there were too many female participants, or indeed, the authors themselves note that this particular concept that they're talking about is rife with difficulties because of the context in which it was written. So look at the discussion section and see how you can use it to its maximum impact. What you also want to then be doing is then relating it back to your question. So what does that mean about the question at hand? This is going to come up time and time again. It will particularly come up for those of you who are on the MSc in counselling. What I like to see as a marker and what the rest of the team on MSc counselling like to see as markers is you thinking beyond academia as well. We want to see you thinking about contexts. What do some of these pictures represent to you? Here in the top right hand corner, we've got government, we've got politics, we've got the way in which healthcare and people's well-being and lifestyles are very much governed in the political landscape that we find ourselves in. We've got education, we've got the way in which theory relates to education and the education impacts on generations of children. For those of you on MSc Counselling and perhaps on some of the other MSc programmes, we've got big institutions like the NHS, we've got legislation, and obviously for those of you in counselling or perhaps those of you in other MScs, we've also got the actual practice of doing the thing that you're studying. When I see people using these contexts to help build arguments, to help critique arguments and to synthesize, so to bring aspects together, that really can gain marks when done skillfully. It's not even that I can't recommend it enough. Actually, at MSc, I fully expect to see it. And I hope some of the other markers would agree with me. At master's level, we really need to see you thinking about what goes on out there in relation to the question that you're answering. Another thing which can really gain marks, and again you will see it, well, I'll put up just on the next slide, I'll be showing you the marking criteria, is originality. At level 6, for those of you who have just completed level 6, it was probably enough to start to do some of the things I've suggested with a bit of context, to gain a few marks. But actually what we really need to see at master's level is you using this to really come up with some new ideas, new solutions, new ideas for potential research, new policies, new ideas around legislation, really to start to think a little bit more outside the box using well-argued, well-researched research, theory and context. And you can see when we look at the marking criteria, which will be on the next slide, how originality fits into that. And again, what you want to be thinking is, what does that mean about the question at hand? Unfortunately, to fit it all on the 2 slides, I have had to make this a little less readable than I would like. But have a look at the marking criteria. This is the marking criteria that we all use at master's level to give you grades. This is the marking criteria which we are using when we moderate each other's work. This is the marking criteria which external examiners will be looking at. This is your best resource for figuring out how to get marks. You might notice some differences for those of you who have just come from level 6 with some of the criteria that we're looking for. If we have a look down the left-hand side, we can see that we're looking for originality, we're looking for independent reflection, and we're looking for that extra level of sophistication of thought. We're looking at this idea of personal initiative, which can be expressed with clarity and stylistic accomplishment. So we're looking at you to really expand your academic language as well, which will help you to create stronger arguments. We're looking at you to be examining theoretical and empirical material, but also important historical context. That's where that context comes in. We're obviously looking at you to be critical, and that's of course where this lecture comes in, but we want you to really think about the high degree of explanatory power rather than just descriptive detail. So go beyond descriptions and into meanings and into critique. We're obviously looking at your work to be maintaining intellectual rigour. So we want to see all hypotheses, all ideas backed up with rigour and with coherence in constructing arguments. Next up, we want you to be seeing linkings made between theory and practice. So for those of you on MSc Counselling, that should be pretty easy, and that's where your context comes in. How does what you're talking about in your assignment link to the actual practice of counselling with a variety of different clients, for instance? And for those of you on other MSc courses, of course, you're also going to be thinking about links between theory and practice. We want you to be thinking about things like research techniques and data collection. So that's when you might be looking at critiquing papers, and obviously in your own piece of research, we really want to be seeing some of those research skills coming out. We want you to be critical. And you can see by the A grade, which is right on the left-hand side, that for those of you who might be receiving an A in this, you'd be using an extensive range of relevant and contemporary resource material, which is at the forefront of the subject. So that's where we might have been talking about age of papers and the kinds of journals that these papers are published in, and the kind of legislation that you might want to be quoting, and the kinds of ideas that are really at the forefront of the issues that you're discussing. And obviously, we want you to be using excellent standards of presentation. If you look to your APA guidance, then that's what we want to be seeing throughout. Let's talk about some other aspects of that here as well. Another slide with tips. These are things which I have often commented on in students' work, so I just wanted to make you aware of them if you ever get marked by me, but I'm sure again some of my colleagues would also agree with some of these issues that do come up in students' work. So let's go over some of the big things that we see quite a lot. I know a lot of you who are studying at MSc level may have come from using a Harvard format of writing, and we're trying to obviously support everybody to really getting used to the strictness of APA. Some people really like that strictness, some people feel constrained by it. But one thing which often comes out with people who are struggling with APA format is remembering that APA format very much embeds itself in this scientific standpoint, and the scientific standpoint will tend to be more removed. So please remember, when using APA format, which you all will be doing for this Masters, please, unless you are specifically told, please do not use I or we. That's first person and second person. You will be being asked to write in the third person. And I've written some suggestions here because you can instead say things like the researcher, or what this may mean, or what this essay will do, or what this piece of work intends to do. There shouldn't be any reason to write I or we unless you're specifically told to. The other mistake that sometimes slips in when it shouldn't do, and perhaps I can explain why it shouldn't be there, is when people use the word proves or proven or proved or shows that or means that. In psychology, we have to be extra tentative, because one of the problems in psychology is that we can never prove anything. And we've sort of covered that in this lecture today, because we've sort of shown that all research is flawed. Psychotherapy research is especially flawed, and because of that we can never prove anything in psychology. So it's really tricky for us to write in definites. It will serve you a lot better to start in general seeing things in much more tentative ways. And again, I've given you some suggestions of how you can phrase that. So this could suggest, this might mean, this could be indicative of, this maybe suggests that. So think about always being tentative in your writing and never coming to immediately constrained, definite solutions. I've said this already, think about how you're going to balance breadth and depth. What that often means is that you will have to make editorial decisions about what you are going to cover in your assignment and what you are not going to cover. It will not be possible to cover everything that you want to cover, and be especially aware of that if the assignment that you're doing is something that you feel very passionately about, because passion is often something that is very difficult to discipline and constrain into the assignment brief. So pick your battles, choose quality over quantity, don't chuck the kitchen sink at your assignments. Think about what will really help answer the question. Eyes on the prize when it comes to assignments. What's going to help you answer the question? Leave what's of interest to you and would possibly be interesting but not gain marks to the side. Really focus on the assignment. And that's my final point. Always come back to the task at hand. And I've talked about earlier how you can use synthesis to really help you do that, because you can use your big therefore statement to come back to the question. I hope those little tips are helpful in helping you gain some marks in some of the assignments that you do. My final top tip is this particular website. This is a university in Australia, Monash, who I think have a really excellent study skills site. Not that I don't think that Worcester's is good, but what's nice about the Monash one is it's quite interactive, and you can be completing questionnaires about how critical you are. You can be doing little quizzes and little tasks, and I think that that's a really good way of starting you thinking not only about how to be critical, but about the kind of vocabulary that you can use and about some of the critical skills that we're looking for from your assignments. So I hope this lecture has been useful to you. There's this very small reference section and some further reading on the next slide. Good luck, everybody, and I look forward to meeting you as you progress through your masters. Thanks.